The afternoon sun fell across our living room like a sheet of gold, and for a beat, I thought the house sighed in relief because I was finally home. Then my medical bag slipped from my hand, and the sound it made on the hardwood broke the day in two. A ring flashed where it shouldn't have a hand gripped a waist that wasn't mine, and the cream sofa we'd saved for became a stranger's stage. My name was in the air, soft, startled wrong, and the smile in our wedding photos above the mantel felt like it belonged to another woman. Perfume I didn't wear laced itself through the room. It was familiar in a way that made my stomach clench. I stood, without breathing, a physician who knew exactly where the human heart lives, and for the first time felt mine go quiet. No one moved at first, not even me. Then the world lurched, and I was already turning, already outside, already hearing the door catch behind me like a verdict. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if stories of dignity and justice speak to you, tap like and subscribe, so more of these can find their way to you. I'm Matilda, 35, the kind of doctor who keeps spare granola bars in her desk for patients, and a second pair of flats in her trunk for the days that never end. I grew up in a modest New England town where you waved at the mail carrier and brought soup when someone was sick, where my mother taught me that care is a practice, not a speech. Winter was the bright one, the kind of girl who could spin a party out of mismatched candles and a grocery store cake. I was the steady one, the ride home at midnight. Franklin drifted into my life at a fundraiser I almost skipped, tall and earnest, telling me my work mattered when I'd started to wonder if it did. We built simple things that felt expensive: trust, a rhythm, a first apartment with wobbly shelves we swore we'd replace when we could. Our wedding was small and impossible to forget: a rented garden and a dance floor made of plywood that bowed just enough to make everyone laugh. Winter cried through her toast and slipped me a handkerchief with my initials stitched in blue, and Franklin danced with my mother, promising he'd always bring me back to the light when the hospital days got dark. We bought a little house with a stubborn rosebush and a mailbox with both our names, and we filled it with ordinary grace. Sunday omelets, paint on our elbows, grocery lists that mattered to no one but us. Nathan joined our family a few years later with his soft laugh and careful questions, a man who taught juniors why the past never really leaves and meant every word. On the surface, we were what neighbors envy: 4 chairs around a table, birthdays with too many candles, holidays that stretched late because no one wanted to leave. I was always the one taking the late call, the one slipping out during dessert to answer a nurse's page, the one who knew the sound of fear over a phone line and how to speak into it until both of us could breathe again. Franklin said he admired that about me, said he loved my steadiness, said the world needed more of it, and I believed him because it felt good to be believed. Winter would swing by with flowers that didn't match the vase and laugh at herself, tell me I needed more frivolous things and less heavy talk. I let her fill the quiet with stories and left the heavy where it belonged, at work and out of the house. When tiny frictions appeared: travel, I couldn't take a dinner, I skipped for a consult. We called them seasons, not storms, and promised each other spring. It's funny how you can catalog other people's pain by reflex and still miss your own. The day the ground shifted, I'd spent hours holding bad news gently for people who deserved better, repeating the careful phrases that leave room for hope. I drove home wanting nothing but Franklin's arms and Winter's terrible jokes, the two people who made my day's grief feel carried. The bag slipped, the ring flashed, the perfume bloomed, and the house I loved turned inside out. I didn't shout or break anything, didn't ask a single question. I walked past the rose bush, past the bright letters on the mailbox, to the car that still smelled like coffee and rain. The engine started with a hum I knew by heart, and I let it carry me away from the place where everything I trusted had just changed shape. I didn't know where I was going, only that a door had closed, and whatever came next would require the quiet I was finally willing to keep. I drove without a destination, the neighborhood slipping by in quiet fragments, families pushing strollers on sidewalks, Children laughing at the park swings, neighbors trimming their hedges. Every sight felt like a cruel reminder that the world was moving forward while mine had come undone. My phone buzzed constantly in the passenger seat, Franklin's name flashing one call after another, Winter's messages pouring in behind his. I couldn't bring myself to answer either of them. Each vibration was a sharp reminder of what I'd walked in on and what I could never unsee. I pulled into the old lighthouse lot near the harbor, the place where Franklin had once knelt with a ring and asked me for forever. Sitting there now, staring at the waves striking the rocks, I gripped the steering wheel so hard that the leather groaned under my hands. A sound rose out of me, something raw and broken. But as it faded, another feeling slipped in, behind it colder, heavier, and strangely steady. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I checked into a downtown hotel, sliding my card across the counter, as though hiding from my own name. The room was impersonal cream walls, a desk too polished to be comfortable curtains that blocked out the city lights. But it became the one place where I could think without interruption. I lined up papers across the desk, bills, bank statements, printouts from my medical practice. My laptop glowed with tabs about divorce law, property rights, and investigators. I told myself I needed the distraction, but deep down, I knew this wasn't about distraction. It was about preparation. For years, I had been the one holding other people's pain, absorbing their panic, and stitching them back together. Now it was my turn to decide how to handle my own. Franklin found me on the third day. I knew he would. The city wasn't large, and my name wasn't exactly hidden at the hotel. His knock came at mid-afternoon, his voice breaking through the door. "Matilda, I know you're in there. Please, just let me explain." I froze where I sat on the bed, my laptop balanced across my knees, cursor blinking over a half-written note about asset division. He sounded desperate, almost frantic, as he told me he had been to every hotel in town begging me to come out. "Baby, please." He added the word that once softened me, now making my stomach turn. He went on about Winter, how she had confessed to Nathan and been thrown out, how she was staying at our mother's house crying every night. He said she was unraveling without my forgiveness. I closed my laptop and set it aside, but I never moved toward the door. Not a word escaped me. The silence felt more powerful than anything I could have shouted. He tried again, his words tumbling out like broken promises. He told me it hadn't been what it looked like, that it had been a mistake, meaningless physical, nothing more. I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. I had stood there long enough to see how practiced they were together, how easily their bodies moved in rhythm. That wasn't the awkwardness of one careless night. That was history. Every word he spoke through the door only made it clearer that he was still choosing lies over truth. He swore he loved me, that he had loved me since the night we met at that dreadful conference years ago. He brought up our jokes, our shared beginnings, as though nostalgia could mend betrayal. I sat perfectly still, watching the clock tick. The man I thought I knew was crumbling outside my door, and all I could feel was a slow, deliberate clarity. When he finally left the hallway, fell silent, and I picked up my phone. I typed one short message and hit send. "Meet me tomorrow night at 7. Marcelos, alone." It was the restaurant where we'd celebrated our first anniversary, where he had whispered about children and a future neither of us could see clearly yet. His reply came almost instantly, full of relief and declarations of love. I didn't answer. Instead, I scrolled to another contact, Nathan Morrison. He was a decent man who had never deserved what Winter had done. "Nathan, this is Matilda. I know it's uncomfortable, but I think we need to talk." His response came quickly. "I was hoping you'd reach out. There are things you need to know about Franklin and Winter. Things that go back further than you think." My pulse quickened as I read it. Longer than I thought. How much longer I set a meeting with him the next afternoon at a small cafe and turned back to my desk. For the first time since that terrible day, the heaviness in my chest eased. Beneath the grief, there was a shape forming, something with purpose. Something almost steady. The next day, Brewster's Cafe hummed with the sound of keyboards and espresso machines, a cover of normalcy for a conversation that would change everything. I chose a corner table with a view of both doors. A habit that had followed me from residency. Always know your exits. Nathan arrived right on time. He looked worn, as though months had passed since I'd last seen him, not weeks. His eyes were shadowed, his clothes unpressed, but his voice carried a quiet steadiness when he greeted me. We exchanged only a few pleasantries before I asked the question burning through me. How long? He didn't hesitate. The physical part, around 8 months. But emotionally longer. Much longer. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Do you remember Winter's engagement party 4 years ago? I nodded slowly, recalling how Franklin had volunteered for every task, from the flowers to the menu, while Winter glowed under his attention. Nathan's smile twisted bitterly. I thought it was sweet at the time. Now I know better. The messages I found go back that far. Late nights, private jokes, compliments that never should have been written. It wasn't just a lapse, Matilda. It was a pattern. My stomach turned, every memory rearranging itself in this new light. Family dinners, where Winter insisted on helping in the kitchen, holiday trips, where she lingered too close, all the moments I had brushed aside, now pulsed with meaning. Nathan admitted he had doubted his instincts, convinced himself it was paranoia. Each time he confronted her, she accused him of being controlling, jealous, imagining things. I wanted to believe her, he said quietly, hands wrapped around his coffee cup as though it might anchor him. But deep down, I knew. I just couldn't face it. He described how Winter changed her clothes when she knew Franklin would be there, how her eyes lit up when Franklin's name entered a conversation. The evidence was there all along, but neither of us had wanted to look. I asked about the weekend I'd been away at a medical conference presenting research that had consumed months of my life. Winter had texted me constantly, cheering me on, asking for updates, telling me how much she missed me. Nathan's face darkened as he told me he had driven past my house at midnight. Both cars were there, hers and Franklin's. When he confronted her afterward, she brushed it off with another lie, claiming she'd only stopped by to return something and stayed to talk. They had made a game of it, weaving lies together, while I stood on the outside, proud of my work, and oblivious to the shadows inside my own home. I felt the weight of it settle over me, but alongside it came a sharp, cold calm. Nathan, I asked, meeting his eyes, do you want to get back at them? He looked at me for a long time, studying my face, as though searching for the woman he once knew in me. Finally, he set his coffee down with a steady hand. What do you need from me? That was when I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The two people they had betrayed most were now sitting together, partners in something Franklin and Winter couldn't imagine. I told him I needed evidence, patience, and trust. He gave me his hand across the table and I took it, feeling the strength in the quiet gesture. We didn't need loud promises or declarations. We both understood. The time for grief was closing. Something else was beginning to take its place. By the time I left the cafe, the afternoon sun had shifted, painting long lines of light across the sidewalk. I walked to my car with a steadier step than I had in days. Franklin and Winter thought they knew me, thought they understood what I would accept and how I would fold. They had no idea what was coming. And as I started the car, I knew exactly where I would be tomorrow night, sitting across from Franklin at Marcelo's, listening to the lies he still thought he could sell me while holding a plan he would never see coming. I arrived at Marcelo's 15 minutes early. My red dress smoothed down with careful hands. It was the same one Franklin had bought me for my birthday 2 years before, and I paired it with the necklace he had fastened around my neck on our wedding morning. I wasn't there to rekindle what he thought was love. I wanted him to see what he had put at risk, to sit across from the woman he was losing and believe for just a moment that I might still give him a chance. When Franklin entered, his steps were uneven, his hair unkempt, his shirt wrinkled as though he had dressed in the dark. The sight of him unsettled me, not because I felt pity, but because I knew how easily he still played the role of a man in love. He took the seat across from me, his hands trembling slightly as he reached forward. I folded mine in my lap, leaving his grasp unanswered. "You look beautiful," he whispered, eyes searching mine for forgiveness. I let the silence hang, then asked quietly, "How is Winter?" He flinched at her name, his shoulders sagging. He muttered that she was staying with our mother, broken and inconsolable, desperate for my forgiveness. "And you?" I pressed. "Are you sorry?" He lowered his eyes, voice breaking, as he swore he was insisting it had been a mistake, a one-time lapse born of wine and weakness. He begged me to believe he had never stopped loving me. His words spilled out in rehearsed lines, each one tugging at memories I used to hold dear. But I sat still and studied him, like I might study a patient searching for the truth behind the symptoms. When I asked him how long the affair had lasted, he swore it was 6 weeks. The number was carefully chosen, meant to soften the blow, to make it sound recent and fleeting. I slid my phone across the table, the screen glowing with messages Nathan had shared, messages full of longing and plans stretching back months. Franklin's face drained of color as he read the evidence, his lips moving silently, as if trying to rewrite the words in front of him. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice low, almost panicked. I let him sit in that silence before answering. "It doesn't matter where. What matters is that you're still lying to me even now." His hands shook as he tried to gather excuses, promising that none of it meant anything, that she had been a distraction, that I was the only one he wanted. But I heard nothing in his words except the confirmation of how easily he lied. I pulled a folded sheet of paper from my purse and laid it on the table. His confusion flickered into disbelief as he scanned the lines of a post-nuptial agreement. "What is this?" he asked, his voice rising. "It's the only path forward," I replied calmly. The agreement was precise. I would keep my medical practice, our savings, and our home. He would keep his business and his car. Any violation of a no-contact clause with Winter would leave me with everything and him with nothing. Franklin shook his head, calling it extreme, but his fear of losing me overrode his protest. "If you want this marriage to survive," I said softly, "you'll sign it now." I held his gaze until his resistance crumbled. He signed without reading the finer details, without realizing he had placed his future in my hands. He looked up with tears brimming, whispering that he loved me, that he would spend the rest of his life proving it. I smiled, squeezing his hand, as though the agreement had repaired something between us. Inside, I knew I had just secured the foundation for what came next. We left the restaurant arm in arm, Franklin clinging to me as though the evening had sealed a new chapter for us. I allowed him to believe it, to walk with the relief of a man who thought his sins had been forgiven. But when I closed our front door that night, I lay awake with the sound of his steady breathing beside me and thought only of Winter. She had been cast out of her marriage unwelcome in our mother's home, left adrift in the wreckage she had helped create. I knew it was only a matter of time before she reached out to me, and I intended to be ready when she did. It happened 3 days later, just after dawn. My phone buzzed with a message that lit across the screen in her name. "Matilda, please. I know you hate me, but I need to talk to you. I'm losing my mind. You're the only family I have left." I stared at the words for a long moment, sipping my coffee on the patio, while Franklin hurried off to a business meeting, kissing my cheek with practiced tenderness. Then I typed a single reply. Meet me at Grandview Park. 10 o'clock. By the pond where we used to feed the ducks. Her answer came quickly, full of relief and gratitude. I set the phone aside and prepared myself not by choosing clothes or makeup, but by rehearsing every word I would allow myself to say. The park was quiet that morning, the air cool and heavy with the scent of spring blossoms. Winter sat waiting on the bench where we had once shared secrets as girls. She looked nothing like the sister I remembered. Her hair pulled back hastily. Her clothes wrinkled her face, blotched from tears. When I approached, she stood quickly, her voice trembling as she said my name. I remained seated, leaving space between us, letting her carry the weight of the silence. She launched into apologies, into explanations, saying it had never been planned, that it just happened, that she had fallen in love against her will. Her words poured out with desperation, and she clutched at the memory of our closeness, begging me to believe she hadn't meant to hurt me. I listened without interrupting, then pulled out my phone and showed her the messages Nathan had saved, the ones filled with declarations of passion and hotel room arrangements. Winter's face blanched as she realized how much I knew. You didn't just hurt me, I told her quietly. You dismantled my life piece by piece while pretending to be my sister. You lied to Nathan, to me, to everyone. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing that she had tried to stop, that Franklin made her feel understood in ways no one else had. She asked if she was going to lose everything, her marriage, her family, her place in my life. I kept my voice steady. That's not for me to decide anymore. You'll stay away from Franklin completely. You'll get real help, not excuses. And you'll wait. You'll wait as long as it takes for me to look at you without remembering this betrayal. She nodded through her tears, promising anything, clinging to the faint hope of forgiveness. But I gave her nothing more than instructions. The bond we once had been severed too cleanly to stitch back together in a single morning. When I rose to leave, Winter grabbed for one last scrap of comfort. She told me Franklin had chosen me, that the day I walked in, he told her it was over, that his love for me outweighed what they shared. I paused, absorbing the twist of her words, then looked at her steadily. This meeting wasn't for you, I said. It was for me. I needed to hear what you'd tell yourself, to see if I recognized any part of the sister I once trusted. I have my answer now. I left her there, tears streaking her face as she sat alone on the bench where we had once been children. For the first time since the day of discovery, I felt a measure of release. Phase 2 was complete. Winter was isolated, guilt-ridden, and cut off from Franklin. What neither of them realized was that I wasn't finished. I had only cleared the ground. The real design of my plan was still ahead, and it would require both of them to believe I was the forgiving woman they had counted on for so long. 3 weeks into what Franklin believed was our reconciliation, our home had grown quiet in a way that seemed almost rehearsed. He rose early, setting out coffee on the counter before I left for the hospital, then slipped notes into my bag, as though reminders of his devotion could erase the months of deceit. To everyone around us, it looked like a couple clawing its way back from betrayal, holding on to love by sheer will. In reality, it was a performance, and Franklin was the only one who didn't know the ending had already been written. Each bouquet of roses, every dinner reservation, every display of public tenderness made my colleagues and friends murmur about his commitment. What they couldn't see was that he was clinging to an illusion while I cataloged each move, waiting for the cracks to show. It was a weekday afternoon when he appeared at my office carrying white roses, my supposed favorite. Angela, my nurse, peeked in first with a smile, whispering that my husband was here again, eager to surprise me. Franklin stepped inside with all the confidence of a man sure he was winning me back, leaning down to kiss my cheek before placing the bouquet on the desk. "I thought you might need a little cheering up after your morning cases," he said, his tone soft and calculated. I nodded, thanked him, and let him believe his presence was welcome. What struck me wasn't the flowers or his words, but how he had suddenly grown so attentive to details of my schedule, things he had once barely noticed. It wasn't devotion. It was strategy. He settled into the chair across from me and folded his hands the way he did when he was nervous. "I have news," he said, leaning forward. "The Morrison Group called. They want me for a partnership position, but it's in Seattle." My pulse quickened, though I kept my expression steady. He spoke with an eagerness that almost sounded like relief. "It would be perfect for us, Matilda, a fresh start, away from everything here. We could buy a house near the water, and you could take time for yourself. Maybe even focus on starting our family." His words drifted across the office like a carefully placed net designed to capture me in a new future that erased all traces of what had happened here. But what he didn't know was that Seattle had already become part of my plan, only not in the way he intended. I told him I would think about it, keeping my voice measured. Disappointment flickered across his face, but he nodded, eager to show his patience. "It could fix so much," he insisted. "Being here, seeing Winter being reminded every day, it makes it harder for both of us." He caught himself too late, realizing what he had just admitted. I tilted my head, letting the silence draw out the weight of his words. He tried again, backtracking, saying he only meant he felt guilty for the pain he had caused. But I could see it clearly. He wanted to run from the wreckage he created to smooth over his guilt with distance and new scenery. I let him take my hands, promising he would do anything to make me trust him again. My heart stayed steady, cold in its refusal. He didn't see it. He thought I was still deciding. That evening, I called Nathan. He answered on the first ring, his voice low, as if he already guessed what I had to say. "He wants to move us to Seattle," I told him, leaning against the kitchen counter with the phone pressed to my ear. Nathan exhaled heavily. "That fits with what she's been telling me," he said. Winter had been leaving him messages, convinced that Franklin was only staying with me out of guilt, convinced that if she could get him alone, she could win him back. She had even started looking into jobs there, telling Nathan that Seattle was their chance at a real beginning. I listened carefully as he described her obsession, her unwavering belief that Franklin's future belonged to her. When he finished, I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Then we'll let her believe it," I said quietly. "Encourage her. Make her think Seattle is exactly what she needs to chase." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, then asked, "What exactly are you planning?" My answer was simple. Justice. For both of us. That night, Franklin sat at his desk researching Seattle neighborhoods, while I stood in the doorway watching the glow of the screen reflect off his tired face. I stepped inside, placed a hand on his shoulder, and told him I was ready. His eyes lit with relief. "You mean it?" he asked, gripping my hand. I nodded, and he pulled me into his arms, whispering how much he loved me, how this was their new beginning. I let him believe it, resting my head against his chest as he dreamed aloud about a waterfront house and the life we would build. Then I pulled back, adding one condition. "I want us to renew our vows before we move." I said, my tone gentle but firm. "Small, private, with our closest family. I want to begin fresh with a public promise." His eyes filled with emotion, and he agreed instantly, saying it was the perfect way to seal our new chapter. He didn't realize it was the beginning of his undoing. Over the next 2 weeks, the invitations went out cream card stock with gold trim, elegant enough to suggest redemption. Franklin wanted the best of everything, eager to show the world how devoted he was. I made sure Winter received one, He objected at first, telling me it would be too painful, too complicated, but I insisted. "She's my sister," I said. "If we're really moving forward, we can't hide from that." The truth was, I needed her there. The plan required her presence, her eyes fixed on Franklin as he stood at the altar and pledged himself to me in front of everyone we loved. It wasn't forgiveness she would witness. It was the shattering of her delusion. Winter called me after the invitation arrived. Her voice was fragile, but there was a strange edge of determination beneath it. "I want to come," she said. "I've been in therapy, and my doctor says facing hard things is part of healing. If you can forgive me enough to invite me, I can be strong enough to attend." I let a pause stretch before answering, then told her it was her choice. She thanked me through tears, saying she wanted to prove she could be the sister I deserved. I ended the call with polite calm, then sat in silence, knowing exactly what I had set into motion. Winter would come to watch, believing she still had a chance, believing Seattle was the place where her story with Franklin would begin again. She had no idea she was walking straight into the moment that would strip her of every illusion. As the day drew near, Franklin's nervous energy filled the house. He checked the flowers, the catering, the seating chart, anxious for everything to be perfect. I moved through the preparations with measured grace, never letting on that my own heart was not bound to the vows we were preparing. The morning of the ceremony, he brought me coffee in bed, his hands trembling slightly as he told me how much he loved me, how he couldn't wait to stand beside me and promise forever, all over again. I kissed him softly, nodding, letting him believe he had finally rebuilt what he had destroyed. Inside, I held on to the knowledge that by nightfall, Franklin and Winter would no longer have a stage for their lies. They would have only the truth laid bare in front of everyone who mattered. What they didn't understand yet was that I hadn't just prepared vows. I had prepared evidence, witnesses, and a stage set not for reconciliation, but for exposure. And as I fastened this necklace Franklin once gave me standing before the mirror in a dress chosen for this very day, I told myself the time for silence was over. The time for truth had finally arrived. The morning of our vow renewal arrived bright and clear, the kind of spring day that carried more promise than it deserved. Franklin was already buzzing with nervous energy, fussing with his tie in the mirror, while I moved quietly through the motions of getting ready. He kissed the top of my head, whispering how grateful he was that we had made it through the storm. How today was the proof that love always won. I nodded softly, watching his reflection in the glass. He believed it. That was all that mattered. My silence was the most powerful agreement I could give. At the Riverside Gardens, the chairs were lined in neat rows, white satin, tied with green ribbons, soft music filling the air. Our friends, colleagues, and family members trickled in, smiling and whispering about second chances. I felt their eyes on me, the wronged wife, with a forgiving heart. Franklin shook hands and greeted guests, soaking in the admiration of those who thought he had earned his redemption. To them, he was the man who had faltered but fought for his marriage. To me, he was the man walking willingly into the final act of his undoing. I spotted Winter near the back, her frame small against the swell of guests. She had dressed carefully in a pale dress that might have been chosen to make her look fragile, almost penitent. She clutched a tissue, dabbing her eyes even before the ceremony began, as though playing her own role in a theater only she understood. Her gaze sought Franklin, not me clinging to him in a way she thought others wouldn't notice. But I noticed. Nathan noticed too, his jaw set, as he stood at the edge of the gathering, watching his estranged wife with a look that mixed sorrow and resolve. He gave me a small nod when our eyes met, a reminder that we were in this together. The ceremony began with gentle music, Franklin stepping forward to take my hands, as though he had earned the right to hold them. His voice trembled as he read the vows he had written, promising to cherish me to honor me, to never betray me again. Tears shone in his eyes as he spoke his words, crafted to stir sympathy from the crowd. Guests leaned in, many already brushing their cheeks with tissues, convinced they were watching love triumph over betrayal. I let him finish my expression, calm, my eyes steady. Then I cleared my throat and signaled to the back of the room. Nathan stepped forward with a small projector and laptop, setting them quietly on the table, prepared for the reception. Confused whispers rippled through the rows as the screen behind us flickered to life. Franklin glanced at me, his smile faltering. I held his gaze for a long moment, then turned to face the screen. The first message appeared, his words to Winter, written late at night, promising her things he had never promised me. Gasps rose from the guests, the room tightening with shock. Franklin's face drained of color, his mouth opening in protest, but more messages followed. Hotel receipts, photos, threads of conversations stretching across months. Winter covered her face, but her trembling shoulders gave her away. Franklin reached for my arm, whispering fiercely, "Turn it off, Matilda. Please, this isn't the time." His voice cracked, desperate. I pulled my arm free. "This is exactly the time," I said clearly, my words carrying across the hushed gathering. "You asked me to renew our vows in front of everyone we love. I'm simply telling the truth in front of them, too." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Irene pressed her hand to her chest. Daniel shook his head in disbelief, and Nathan stood tall, arms crossed, finally vindicated. I slipped the folded divorce papers from my purse and placed them in Franklin's shaking hands. "You signed the post-nuptial agreement. You gave me the tools I needed. Today, I won't be renewing vows. I'll be reclaiming my dignity." He stumbled over his words, calling me cruel, calling it unnecessary, pleading that we could still fix what was broken. But no one in that garden saw a man worth defending anymore. They saw a liar, a cheater, a husband who had betrayed not only his wife, but the sanctity of the family he pretended to value. Winter stood then, her tissue crumpled in her hand, her voice breaking as she cried out that Franklin had chosen her, that I was twisting the story. Guests turned to her, their faces hardening. Nathan stepped forward, his voice steady and cold. "Sit down, Winter. Everyone here can see the truth now. It's over." She collapsed back into her chair, sobbing openly, stripped of the quiet illusion she had clung to. Franklin reached toward her, then hesitated, realizing how it looked. His indecision sealed their downfall in one clear moment. I slid the ring from my finger and placed it gently on the table beside the projector. "This doesn't belong to me anymore," I said, my voice calm but unyielding. Then I walked down the aisle I had once walked as a bride, only this time I carried no veil, no flowers, no promise. I carried only freedom. Behind me, guests rose in stunned silence, their whispers a storm that would follow Franklin and Winter long after the ceremony ended. When I stepped into the spring air outside, Nathan joined me. He didn't speak right away, just walked beside me in silence. Finally, he said, "You did what needed to be done." I nodded, breathing deeply, the weight of years lifting from my chest. The vow renewal had become their reckoning. The performance was over, and now the reality would begin. What remained was the aftermath, the collapse of their carefully built lives, the unraveling of their reputations, and the quiet rebuilding of my own life. As Franklin's voice rose in the distance trying to salvage his image, I knew he had no ground left to stand on. And I knew I wasn't finished yet. The world had only just begun to see the truth, and soon justice would reach every corner of the lives they had tried to control. The weeks after the vow renewal were marked by silence, though not the kind that healed. Franklin barely spoke to me unless pressed, moving through the house like a man underwater. His business calls grew shorter, his laughter vanished, and his appetite shrank. The humiliation at Riverside Gardens had settled on him like a weight he could not shake, and though he tried to mask it with small gestures, taking out the trash, folding laundry, he no longer dared to ask for closeness. Our home had become a waiting room, where he sat quietly hoping time might still offer him a reprieve. I knew differently. Winter called my phone 3 times in the first week after the ceremony. Each message was a mixture of pleading and defiance, her voice raw as she insisted Franklin had still chosen her in secret. She said she could not understand why he stayed, why he continued clinging to a marriage that was clearly finished. I never answered. Nathan did, though. He shared with me the threads of her desperation late-night texts about Seattle promises that she would fix everything once he came to his senses. Winter was unraveling, but she hadn't yet realized the spotlight had shifted away from her. It was Franklin who carried the heavier burden now, and the cracks in him were spreading quickly. One evening, I returned home to find him sitting in the darkened living room, the glow of his laptop casting harsh shadows across his face. He looked up as I set my bag down. "I've decided," he said softly, "I'm going to Seattle. There's nothing left for me here." He tried to sound resolved, but his voice wavered. "You'll keep everything our home the practice. I'll start fresh. It's better for both of us." I watched him carefully. The man who once swore our life together was enough now choosing exile over accountability. "Will you be going alone?" I asked, my tone even. His eyes darted away, the pause between us heavier than any confession. He muttered something about focusing on work, about rebuilding. The name he avoided said more than his words ever could. I let the silence settle, then told him I hoped Seattle gave him what he was looking for. He seemed almost relieved by my lack of resistance, mistaking it for surrender. He didn't understand that I had already orchestrated his downfall, and his leaving would only strip him further of the support he thought he could count on. Franklin mistook mercy for weakness, and I let him believe it, watching as he dug his own grave with every plan he shared. The night before he was due to leave, Winter appeared on my porch. Her hair was unkempt, her face pale, her eyes swollen from tears. She clutched her coat around herself and asked if she could come in. I stood in the doorway, the cold air rushing between us. "Please, Matilda," she whispered. "He's going to Seattle, and he promised me we'd be together. I need to hear it from you. Are you letting him go?" Her desperation was laid bare, trembling in the half-light. I kept my voice steady. "Winter Franklin isn't mine to give. He's made his choice." She reached for my arm, her grip shaking. "Then you'll see, Seattle will be ours." I pulled away and closed the door gently, leaving her alone on the porch. Through the curtains, I watched her walk slowly back to her car, shoulders hunched against the night. The next morning, Franklin wheeled his suitcase to the curb. His handshake with Daniel was awkward. Irene barely met his eyes, and neighbors who had once admired him offered polite but restrained farewells. He hugged me lightly, whispering that he hoped time would soften me, that maybe one day I would remember the man I had married instead of the one I had exposed. I didn't respond. I simply stepped back and let him close the cab door, his figure shrinking as the car pulled away. Winter's sedan followed minutes later, as predictable as a shadow. I stood on the porch long after the street fell quiet, the chill sinking through my coat. Nathan joined me later that day, carrying a small folder under his arm. We sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from our coffee mugs as he laid the papers out between us. They were more records, more screenshots, more fragments of a truth Franklin and Winter could never outrun. Together, they painted a story of calculation, deceit, and manipulation that stretched years. "They built this on lies," Nathan said, his voice low. "Now they'll have to live with what it cost them." I knotted my fingers, brushing the edges of the documents. The evidence no longer felt like a weapon. It felt like a memorial of the woman I had been, the one they had tried to erase. That night, I walked through the quiet house, each room carrying echoes of what once was. The roses Franklin had left on the counter weeks earlier had wilted, their petals curling inward. I didn't throw them away. I left them there, a reminder that appearances die quickly when roots are shallow. Upstairs, I stood before the mirror, unfastening the necklace I had worn through every stage of this unraveling. Setting it gently in the jewelry box, I whispered to myself that the past was finished. What remained was the aftermath, and the reckoning was far from over. The next stage wasn't about secrets anymore. It was about exposure so complete that neither Franklin nor Winter could pretend otherwise. And as I lay down to sleep in the quiet of my own bed, I knew the stage was set for the truth to reach every corner of the lives they had tried so hard to control. Seattle was supposed to be Franklin's escape, the place where he could start over, away from the eyes that knew too much. Instead, it became the stage where every secret unraveled. Within weeks of his arrival, his new colleagues began whispering. Word of our vow renewal and the humiliating exposure that followed had traveled faster than he could outpace. The projection of his late-night messages and the divorce papers handed to him in public were now the story that preceded him everywhere he went. He tried to hold his head high in meetings, tried to bury himself in work. But the sideways glances and hushed voices carried their own verdict. Winter followed him west, just as I knew she would. She rented a small apartment near the waterfront, convinced that Franklin only needed time before he admitted they belonged together. She called him incessantly, left notes on his car windshield, and appeared at the coffee shop he favored every morning. At first, he let her orbit around him, too weary to fight her persistence. But as the weight of his ruined reputation grew heavier, her presence turned from comfort to suffocation. Colleagues spotted her waiting outside the office, her voice raised in desperation when he refused to stop. By then, the very partnership that had drawn him to Seattle began to crumble. A man once respected for his composure and reliability was now viewed as unstable, tangled in personal chaos that overshadowed his work. Back home, I read every update Nathan sent. He had contacts in Seattle, an old college friend who worked in Franklin's new firm, a neighbor who had seen Winter pacing the building lobby. Each story painted the same picture, the two of them unraveling in public, powerless to control the narrative that had slipped through their fingers. The post-nuptial agreement ensured I was protected. The house, the savings, even Franklin's stake in my practice were already mine. What remained for him was only shame and Winter's delusion that his downfall was somehow proof of their love. One evening, Franklin called me. His voice was raw, stripped of pride. "Matilda," he said quietly, "I know you hate me, but I need you to understand I never wanted it to end this way." I listened without responding, letting the silence speak for me. He went on, confessing that the city felt hostile, that he couldn't shake the looks, that every introduction was shadowed by what had happened. "I can't breathe here," he admitted. "Winter won't leave me alone, and everyone else just sees me as a man who ruined everything." "Do you know what that's like?" His question hung in the air. I thought of the day I had walked in on them, the months of lies, the nights I spent alone in that hotel room, piecing my life back together. I didn't need to answer. He already knew. Meanwhile, Winter's life collapsed more quickly. Nathan had filed for divorce, citing infidelity with evidence that left no room for denial. Friends who once admired her energy now avoided her calls, unwilling to be pulled into the chaos she created. Even Irene and Daniel kept their distance, weary from her insistence that she was misunderstood, that she had been robbed of the life she deserved. Winter pressed forward with Franklin as her only hope, clinging to him as though he were both her anchor and her prize. But Franklin cornered, and unraveling began to push her away. Their arguments spilled into public view, raised voices in parking lots, Slammed doors in apartment hallways, tears that drew stares from neighbors. The two of them had built their bond on secrecy and stolen glances, and without the cover of shadows, it withered under the light. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Their world was collapsing by the weight of their own choices. At the hospital, I moved through my days with steady purpose, my patients and colleagues unaware of the storm that had already passed. At night, I sat by the fire reading Nathan's quiet updates, each one a reminder that justice didn't always roar, it sometimes arrived in steady, patient waves. One evening, Nathan called instead of writing. "It's over," he said simply. Winter had shown up at Franklin's office again, demanding he leave with her, insisting that Seattle was their new beginning. He'd told her in front of his colleagues that she was nothing more than a mistake. She broke down sobbing as security escorted her out. By morning, everyone in the firm knew. Franklin's position was already under review. That night, I walked through my home, pausing at the rose bush blooming stubbornly outside the window. Franklin had once promised me we'd plant another when we had children. Now the bush stood alone, resilient in its defiance. I thought of Winter clinging to promises that never belonged to her. I thought of Franklin scrambling for dignity he had thrown away with his own hands, and I thought of myself not as the betrayed wife anymore, but as the woman who had endured, waited, and reclaimed her power without ever raising her voice. By the time the letter from Franklin arrived, his downfall was complete. Written on hotel stationery, the words were uneven, desperate. He apologized, begged me to remember the man he once was, asked if there was any path to forgiveness. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into a drawer unopened after the first reading. Some words weren't meant to be answered. They were meant to remain exactly where they belonged in the past. Their world had collapsed. Mine was still standing, and as I closed the drawer, I knew there was only one chapter left, to write the chapter where I would choose not what had been done to me, but what I would become after it. Seattle became their undoing. Franklin had left believing he could escape the whispers, but shame travels faster than any plane ticket. His new colleagues learned quickly about the ceremony, the public unraveling the evidence laid bare for everyone to see. He tried to hold on, tried to rebuild, but each attempt collapsed under the weight of the truth he had carried with him. Winter followed him as I knew she would convince that persistence could rewrite reality. She trailed him through city streets, left messages he ignored, and clung to a story that no longer existed. In time, even Franklin admitted she had been a mistake. His words sharp enough to finally break through her denial. By then, she was alone. Nathan gone, friends gone, reputation gone. She had traded everything for a dream that never belonged to her. My own life moved in a different rhythm. The house became mine, fully each corner, slowly remade in ways that felt lighter, freer. The couch where I had seen the betrayal was replaced with one I chose only for myself. The roses he had planted were pulled up, replaced with blooms that felt honest in their simplicity. My days at the hospital remained demanding, but the work steadied me. Each patient I guided through loss reminded me that pain could also be a beginning. Nathan and I kept in touch. Sometimes it was a quick message about Winter's latest attempt to rewrite her past. Sometimes a shared laugh at how far we had both come. He found new companionship, someone kind and steady, and it was good to see him smile again. We were no longer bound by anger, but by quiet understanding. We had survived the same storm, and now we were both learning how to walk forward without its weight. Franklin sent letters from time to time, filled with apologies, regrets, and questions I never answered. I kept the first one folded in a drawer as a reminder of what I endured and what I overcame. The rest I discarded. Forgiveness was no longer mine to give. It was his to seek elsewhere. As for Winter, the last I heard, she had moved again, searching for another beginning. I hoped she would someday stop running long enough to see herself clearly. Justice, I learned, doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it's quiet, the steady crumbling of lies, until all that remains is truth. I didn't shout. I didn't rage. I simply let the truth breathe, and it was enough. What they destroyed between themselves was punishment enough. What I rebuilt within myself was victory. Looking back now, I see that betrayal carved a hollow place in me. But that hollow didn't stay empty. It filled with resilience, with clarity, with the unshakable knowledge that no one else could define my worth. Franklin and Winter thought they were writing my ending, but all they did was hand me a pen. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more stories of resilience and justice, stay connected here.